Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Dr. Masood Raja, and today I will continue my conversation with you about Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We are still on Chapter 1, and I'm hoping to cover from page 55 to middle of page 57 today. Now, if this is your first time joining us, please do subscribe to the channel so that you can get frequent updates about what's coming next. And within this series, you could watch the previous videos to know where we are. We have already gone through his discussion of the binary structure of power between oppressor and oppressed, the project of critical pedagogy in the first stage we've already discussed is to make the oppressed aware of their own exploitation, and he comes through Lukács to do that. And then the project of critical pedagogy itself, right, which he calls the pedagogy of the oppressed. So in today's talk, we are moving on to his discussion of what happens in this process in which the initial stages of the pedagogy of the oppressed starts. And as in all these lectures, you know the format. I read the text word by word, paragraph by paragraph, and then I add a few insights that I might have. The idea is to actually read the book with you, right? So I'm going to start on page 56. And here is the paragraph. For the oppressors, however, it is always the oppressed, and then in parentheses, whom they obviously never call the oppressed, but depending on whether they are fellow countrymen or not, those people, or the blind and envious masses, or savages, or natives, or subversives, who are disaffected, who are violent, barbaric, wicked, or ferocious when they react to the violence of the oppressor. So this is the question of violence, right? And in the previous lecture, we had talked about how what Freire is talking about is that since the oppressor-oppressed relationship it is established through the violence, right? When the oppressing class looks at the actions, maybe sometimes reactionary, but rebellious actions of the people, of the masses, right? They don't attribute the cause of that violence to themselves. They capture that violence within the body of the oppressed and make them a cause of their actions, right? And these terms that he's using are very instructive, right? The term violent, right? If you look at the Algerian context, the French, by and large, imagined or posited that the Algerian Arab was essentially violent, right? What that enables them to do is to posit that there are no existential causes for that. People can be naturally violent, right? Some same kind of words are implied here about in the United States by right-wing pundits and scholars even and politicians about Muslims, right? Barbaric, right? These were the terms used by the colonizers, right? About in their African colonies, Asian colonies, because that binary structure enabled them to posit the natives as barbaric, and then they could themselves, retrieve their own identity as civilized, wicked, or ferocious. All these terms were used always for the people who were being controlled by the others, by the dominant group, and we still do that. I mean, if you want to expand it a little further, think of patriarchy and the patriarchal vocabularies. Any cultures that believe in superiority of men over women, right, always attribute certain negative connotations to women not being smart enough, women being emotional, right, irrational. These were all the terms used to describe women in Europe as well as currently in so many parts of the world. So the oppressing class always employs these vocabularies to designate in a way the oppressed class, but to also posit that they, the oppressed class, are themselves naturally violent and hence need stronger control, right? But they never think that any violence, semiotic or material that might be coming from the oppressed could have been caused by the very system that the oppressors themselves have maintained, right? And that is what he's talking about here. I'll move on to the next passage, which is on page 53. Yet it is paradoxical, though it may seem, precisely in the response of the oppressed to the violence of their oppressor, that a gesture of love may be found. Consciously or unconsciously, the act of rebellion by the oppressed, in parentheses, an act which is always or nearly always as violent as the initial violence of the oppressors, can initiate love. Let me stop here, right? And he's saying this might sound paradoxical, but a rebellious act by the oppressed, right, to overthrow the oppressing order, even though the oppressors themselves would see it as violent, would see it as cruel, can be an act of love. How? Let's read on, right? It can initiate love. How? Whereas the violence of the oppressors prevents the oppressed from being fully human, the response of the latter, that is the oppressed, to this violence is grounded in the desires to pursue the right to be human. As the oppressors dehumanize others and violate their rights, they themselves also become dehumanized. As the oppressed, fighting to be human, take away the oppressor's power to dominate and suppress, they restore to the oppressors the humanity that they had lost in the exercise of oppression. Now note, this is a permanent theme, in this book of Freire. The question about how to forestall against the possibility in almost all historical revolutions in which the formerly oppressed themselves become an oppressing class. How to stop that from happening. But here what he's also theorizing and talking about is that this act of rebellion by the oppressed can initiate love. How? Because the system against which they are rebelling is a loveless system, right? It's a master-slave system. But if they can dismantle the system, what they have dismantled is the dehumanizing aspects of it. Now remember, we've already learned while reading Freire that in the process of dehumanizing others, the oppressors themselves are dehumanized. They're part of that dehumanizing system. So when the oppressed rise up to liberate themselves, part of their mission is also to liberate their oppressors. And as the initial step, this act of rebellion becomes an act of love, because not only does it free the oppressed, but it also frees the oppressors from the logic of the very dehumanizing system that they themselves had created, right? Thus giving them their humanity or a chance at humanity. Think of it historically. I mean, if you look at the American South, the slave owners, right? They maintained their lifestyles all underwritten by, the labors of the slaves. But in the process, could you imagine someone who owns other human beings as a fully realized human being? They would feel like that within their own system, right? But from looking from outside. So when that oppressive system is overthrown, right? Not necessarily just by the oppressed, after all, there was a war. So what that renders is a new humanity for the former slave owners when they adapt to this new system in which they have to acknowledge that no human being can own another human being and his or her labors, right? That is their path to humanity, right? Because then Now, it would have been worse, the rebellion, if it had come from the slaves. It would have not rendered the same results of freedom, liberation, and humanity if the former slaves had overthrown their oppressors and then made them slaves, right? Now that would have then perpetuated the same logic, right? The same system that Freire is teaching us how to learn to avoid it, right? Let's go to page 57. Now, how do the oppressed free the oppressors? It is only the oppressed who, by freeing themselves, can free their oppressors. The latter, as an oppressive class, can free neither others nor themselves. It is therefore essential that the oppressed wage the struggle to resolve the contradiction in which they are caught, and the contradiction will be resolved by the appearance of the new man, neither oppressor nor oppressed, but man in the process of liberation. If the goal of the oppressed is to become fully human, they will not achieve their goal by merely reversing the terms of the contradiction, by simply changing poles. Now, we've already talked about what this contradiction is, right? Contradiction is the agonistic system of oppressor and oppressed, right? And the oppressed live in it, right? But here again, he is highlighting this important aspect of it, is that only the oppressed can free themselves and their oppressors. Because the oppressors have no reason to change the system. They probably can't even see it critically. They have internalized the logic of it. We are superior. These people who serve us are inferior. That's their lot in the life, right? It's the oppressed who, first of all, must become conscious of their own oppression. And in the process of overthrowing the system of oppression, intentionally also liberate the oppressors, because that system will be destroyed. But in the process, a new kind of human being must come into being, right? Not a dichotomous human being, not a binaristic human being, right? Not a human being who models his or herself on the model of the oppressive system itself, but someone who can liberate his or herself, but also liberate those who had oppressed him. This was crucial, right? Remember, in early work of Fanon, Black Skin, White Masks, when you read it towards the end, where he's talking about, I want a new kind of humanism, right? Where he talks about this profound way of thinking humanity, in which there are neither slave owners nor slaves, nor former slaves, right? This is in the same vein, right? The idea of creating a kind of humanity through praxis and liberation, who frees the human who frees his or herself, but does not become oppressive, right? A lot of people have read Marx and Deleuze and Guattari and Lukács, all these Marxist scholars, to answer this question of how to make sure that post-revolutionary movement, post-liberation, the oppressed themselves do not become the oppressed. I mean, Deleuze famously calls it the possibility in impossibility, that we have to at least imagine that. Here, I mean, if we read Freire carefully, there is a pedagogical answer to that, and that is that that's not going to happen by accident. We must train ourselves, right? The oppressed must learn it themselves and then teach it to us, right? But the liberation, the full realization of their humanity will only happen when they become new kind of humans who are themselves free, but who also free those who had oppressed them and do not reproduce the same logic and the same system. That was page 56, okay? I'm moving on. On page 56 and 57, to describe the nature of oppression. What is oppression? And he says, this may seem simplistic. It is not. Resolution of the oppressor-oppressed contradiction indeed implies the disappearance of the oppressors as a dominant class. However, the restraints imposed by the former oppressed on their oppressors so that the latter cannot reassume their former position do not constitute oppression. Okay, this is crucial. In the previous paragraph, what he's trying to tell us is that we must forestall against the possibility that post-liberation, the oppressed themselves may not become the oppressors, right? But he's qualifying that, right? It's not a free-for-all. After you have changed the political order, the dichotomous order, the agonistic order of oppressed and oppressors, like after you have overthrown your oppressors, right? The actions that you take now as the newly emergent dominant class, the actions that you take to make sure that no one can replicate the older system or create the same dichotomy of oppressor-oppressed, those actions post-liberation, he says, are permissible, right? They do not constitute oppression. Why? An act is oppressive only when it prevents people from being more fully human, right? That is the basic kernel of understanding an oppressive act. Like anytime we tell someone you cannot do this, right? You're a woman, you cannot fly a plane. You're gay, you can't be in the military, right? That is when we are basically telling someone that something inherently about them precludes them from being fully human, right? So what he's saying is that post-liberation, any law or act that makes sure that no one can reassume the roles they had in the former oppressive order or replicate that itself, it does not constitute oppression. The only thing that constitutes as oppression is an act, a law, actions that make someone else's humanity impossible, someone's realization of full humanity impossible or difficult. Accordingly, he says, these necessary restraints do not in themselves signify that just as yesterday's oppressed have become today's oppressors. Acts which prevent the restoration of the oppressive regime cannot be compared with those which create and maintain it, cannot be compared with those by which a few men and women deny the majority the right to be human. Okay, so again, Freire is nothing if not precise, right? So what he's saying is, and think of it this way, a lot of people talk like this. Oh, what if the workers become, the determinants of their own destiny? What will happen to the mill owners, right? And what Freire is saying is that telling the mill owners that they cannot accumulate all the capital and then keep the labor, enslaved is not repression, right? It's not oppression. It is actually, in a way, an act of love, which is making sure that the very system that we came out of cannot be replicated again, cannot resume again, right? So this is where I'm going to stop. So in today's conversation about Paulo Freire's chapter 1, what we have basically covered is he has already gone through introducing to us the different stages of pedagogy of the oppressed. But the main concern in today was how to resolve the oppressor-oppressed contradiction, that agonistic relationship, right? How to ensure that the oppressed themselves do not become the oppressors. But then he goes on to teach us that an act of rebellion against an oppressive system itself is an act out of love, but because what it does is it frees the oppressed, but also forces the oppressors to rethink the system in which they exist, right? to become part of a newer, equitable and just system. And by doing that, by incorporating them into that, it's an act of love because they also become fully human. Furthermore, what he's trying to suggest is in order for any liberation movement or praxis to succeed, the oppressed must not themselves become the oppressors. Their model of defining and practicing their humanity cannot be based in the older order. We talked about it in the previous parts of this lesson, right? And he makes sure to also qualify that any laws, actions, or acts performed by the formerly oppressed, to make sure that the old order cannot reassert itself, cannot be perpetuated, the unjust, dehumanizing order, those cannot be considered oppression. And an act, according to Freire, becomes oppressive only when it hinders, prohibits, right, stops someone from seeking their full humanity, right? Now, do keep in mind that there is, a romantic humanism at play over here. And maybe after we have finished this chapter, we'll talk about that. Why is it problematic now for us post-Derrida, post-Foucault, right, post-anti-humanism, to think that centered human beings? So that was problem in Marx as well, right? So we'll talk about that, but we have to keep how Freire is thinking humanity on this core essential level, and that human struggle is always innate desire to be fully human, to be free. So I'm going to stop here. I hope this was useful to you. As always, if you have any questions, concerns, please send them my way. And please also feel free to post your comments, because they allow me to think about these things differently. We also now have a learning website, where you can go and maybe sign up for some courses that will help us sustain this venture and others. And also, please do subscribe. And as always, I'm grateful that you're part of my life, and I'll be back with more on Freire. And until then, thank you. And as always, peace and love.